Welcome to yet another in the series of conversations that we at the Perth USAsia Centre are extremely fortunate to have with the former ambassador to the United States, Kim Beazley, former defense minister, former leader of the opposition, former governor, and obviously, for us, most importantly, chairman of our board. I really appreciate you taking the time for us to sit together and try to make sense of what's happening in the farthest city on the planet on land away from Perth, which is Washington, D.C.
Exactly.
As it works out well. Look, one of the reasons that Australians, I think, find American politics so interesting is, number one, they matter. They're very important to us, but also because they're so unpredictable. But even by the standard of the relative volatility or unpredictability of American politics, this year has been rather strange. So before we talk about the next 3 weeks, and we're filming this almost exactly 3 weeks out from the U.S. election, can you just give us your step back, big picture kind of view of the campaign thus far? What is notable about 2024 in contrast to the many elections you've watched in the past?
Well, the one thing that's notable about 2024 compared to all elections in the past is that one of the candidates is arguably insane. And, I watched a bit of Trump's, as advised by his opponent, of Trump's rallies. And he is, there is a singular decline in his acuity since when he was running in 2016. And it doesn't make much sense, but as is often the case when people's mental faculties appear to be going, their anger levels rise. And he has become a dangerously angry person. So that's what I note from that. What I do note from the campaign and where we're at the moment compared to, when this sort of really started seriously when Joe Biden stood down and was replaced by Kamala. We said then it was Trump's election to lose, and I'm still afraid I say it's Trump's election to lose. There is I think there's three possible results, and there's still three possible results. One is a narrow Harris win, and another is a narrow Trump win, and another is a somewhat larger Trump win. I think those are the three possibilities. And one hopes for the first, and we may well get there, but the drift at the moment seems not to lift Kamala Harris much further than she got, which was within the margin of error 2 or 3 points above Trump.
Well, thank you. It's rare, but I think I'm a little bit more optimistic, if we will, slightly different on your scenario. Of course, one has to admit there remains a chance for a narrow Trump victory. We saw that in 2016. That's the only election that he's ever won in any form or shape in terms of the process. I think there is a scenario for a narrow Kamala Harris victory, which would itself be quite damaging because it would continue to divide. It wouldn't necessarily provide a rather definitive answer to the challenge that Trumpism has posed for the United States. But I tend to be more optimistic. I tend to remain convinced that it actually would be a larger than 2020 victory for Kamala Harris. And I'll go into that in just a minute as we talk about the next 3 weeks. But going back to that broader question of kind of how different where we are today is, it's useful to take stock, right? For the first time in history, there's a convicted felon who's a candidate of a major party who's technically out on bail in terms of that process, running for president. For the first time, at least in my memory, at least in kind of modern political history, you have a candidate of a major party who did not run at the head of the ticket in the primaries, right? Who's been selected afterwards, right? And remarkable kind of tumult in the overall discourse. And yet, and this is what I want to go back to your first point you made was talking about the relative decline of Trump as an individual and as a candidate in his rallies. If you were thinking back to June or May of this year, every misspoken word, every stumble that Joe Biden made led to hours upon hours of media and political cast commentary that eventually drove him from the race. And yet, in any kind of side-by-side comparison, what you referred to, we're seeing every single day, doesn't seem to be generating the same level of attention. He's now the oldest candidate who's ever run. He will be the oldest president in the history to win the nomination if he wins it. Not the nomination, but the presidency if he wins it. And yet we don't have that same level of attention. Why do you think that is?
Cowardice. I think you're looking at a media in the United States, large elements of which have been substantially cowed by the American far right and its potency in the media. And they treat Harris like you'd normally treat a candidate. You can't complain when you're accused of doing a word salad when you're actually doing a word salad, and you can't complain when, people want to know this or that detail of the policy and you don't give it to them. That's the politics I live with. It's what you expect. But you also expect the other side cops it too. And they are just so frightened of Trump. It's interesting to see them actually with Vance, because Vance has worked out with their coward. So Vance does a lot of media, and he goes down after his speeches. He always does immediately after his speeches, and he goes to the media section. So they're not out of the realm of the crowd around. And then the crowd joins Vance in getting stuck into them, and they collapse. It's a little sub-phenomenon of this campaign that is worth noting, because it reflects the fact that the media sort of give themselves constant medals in the United States. So we watch a lot of American TV, and they're always awarding each other medals. But when they actually come to confronting Trump or doing something like that, they just...
So you've put your finger on something that I'm wrestling with, because on the one hand, it is a staple of Republican campaigns and President Trump and Vice President Vance to complain about the media, to complain about the media coverage, to complain about how unfair it is. It's also a staple of the Democratic Party and candidacy to complain about the media and how unfair it is to do it. And so in some respects, you can see if both sides are complaining, you might think they're kind of getting exactly right. However, for me, without being able to judge the specific allegation of cowardice, right, it does seem to me that there's this question of volume, right? Yeah. Whereas if Kamala Harris has one issue, there might be one particular weakness. There may be something they can ask. That gives them something that the media can focus on. So 2016, it was her emails, right?
Yeah, right.
That single act has been, candidly in the broader spectrum of everything else. It's a relatively small thing, but it was the one thing they could latch on to.
That was to Hillary.
Whereas, as you mentioned from Trump rallies, there are just so many issues upon which to focus, right? Whether it is the allegations of rape of women, or his ongoing the libel convictions that he's had, or the criminal convictions, or the other three criminals out there, or today, the daily threats of violence, the threats to use the media to shut down media stations. It just seems to me there's just so much out there to expect a focus on any one of them when it's such a broad field is a pretty tough thing. And it was challenging 26 years.
It is, but they don't focus on any of it. That's the thing I complain about. And I do think that it's... and in a sense, it probably would matter not too much if they did, from Trump's point of view, because the echo chamber now in of right-wing media is so large that you can basically get away with just ignoring everything and just going back to your echo chamber and broadcasting from that.
Okay, we're going to transition and look forward. As I mentioned, we're almost exactly 3 weeks to the day out from when Americans will go to the polls, although many have already gone to the polls. Right. I'm a dual citizen. I'm registered in Arizona, and my family and I have all registered to vote in Arizona. They've actually got a good system where it's an overseas uniformed and overseas ballot portal where we can just quickly upload our ballots on that system. So it worked out pretty well for me in terms of the process. So that process is ongoing right now. But I want to look ahead. I mercifully am going to spend most of next week in Japan and the week after that in Korea, hiding out as much as possible from U.S. politics, although I don't think it's going to be successful. I guarantee you that there is intense interest in Tokyo and Seoul, just as there is here in Perth or Canberra as well. But looking ahead, you gave 3 scenarios, expressing your concern about those 3 scenarios. What are you looking at? What are you paying attention in the remaining 3 weeks of the campaign until the election on the first Tuesday of November?
Reports of ground games. We've had a bit. Kamala really needs to get youth and minorities out to vote. When you look at the polling in those areas, even though Trump is doing better among the minorities than he's done before, he's still not doing well. And so you need to optimise that. They need to optimise getting the youth out. So what's happening in the unis, what's happening around the show, because American youth are notoriously slumberous when it comes to casting a ballot. So I'm looking at that. I'm also looking at any evidence, and we won't get any until polling day, that the phenomena of the 2 previous elections was that people who were going to vote Trump did not say so. But now it seems that they will. Nobody's frightened about saying that they're going to vote for Trump. Oh, it should be. Well, they're not. But there are quite a lot, particularly in the white community, who are frightened of saying they're going to vote for Harris. So evidence, if you like, that is the case, and that they're going to be more prepared to vote for them than seems likely at the moment. Looking for the surprises. The surprises thus far have been hurricanes, and what has been the surprise on the hurricanes is that Trump has encouraged, and a lot of people have taken up, that they need to abuse FEMA and federal workers, block their ability to come and help people out. That's got to play some part somewhere down the track in North Carolina. Probably not in Florida, but in North Carolina. If I was a citizen of North Carolina, the chances of me voting Republican would be between Buckley's and none, given their performance on aid and assistance to the people of North Carolina. The other is Israel. I think that the Israelis will attack in about another week or 2. And so it'll be before the presidential election. But it does seem, I just see one report today, it does seem that the Israelis will only attack military sites. They'll leave the oil alone and they'll leave the nukes alone. So we'll see.
Obviously, nukes are an entirely different concern. The concern with attacking oil facilities would be the impact that would have on global markets and price spikes in an election that already has an intense focus on inflation in the United States. I can understand that. Well, you laid out, obviously, I think, all of the key issues. You probably sent half of our younger readership out Googling, trying to figure out what Buckley's is or Buckley's chance is. Look it up. That'll be interesting in terms of the process. In my position, I should be more responsible. But responsible is almost by the definition of boring. And sitting next to you, I can be pretty outlandish and still appear relatively responsible. But it is a tight election. It is a deeply divided electorate. I have been quite struck by the fact this year that there really haven't been major bounces one way or the other.
Yeah.
You would have assumed, and I assumed, after an assassination attempt, the imagery that surrounded that first attempt, with the fight, and the raised fist and the blood streaming and the flags flowing, that there would have been a bounce. There wasn't. I would assume that there was going to be a bounce after the Republican National Convention. Traditionally, there is. There wasn't, right? And now, so the question is, people are pretty rusted on in their views. And the challenge for the Trump campaign is they have got something which is historically very advantageous. A really committed, core of about 41% to 43% of the American electorate who will turn up and will vote. And the question then really is, do they expand that? And what is their strategy for expanding that? We really haven't seen that from the campaign for the rest of the year, nor do I think we're likely to see any efforts to reach out to new constituencies in the remaining 3 weeks of the campaign. That then makes, for me, the entire question, the one that you rightly focused on, is just the ability to unify the Democratic Party and independents and to get them to turn out and vote. So for me, again, while relatively irresponsible to predict outcomes, the reason I'm more optimistic than you really just comes down to 3 factors. Number one, women. And we've just seen in so many elections. And so you talked about the fact that historically there has been an undercounting of the Trump vote. I think that was true all the way through 2022 when the much anticipated red wave did not appear, because by that time, by what you said, they were comfortable saying in public that they're going to vote for Trump. Also, I think pollsters kind of figured out certain code words that let people know that they're going to vote for Trump or not, so they weren't looking for the exact statement or not, right? But at the same time, I think you've seen in recent by-elections, at least, an undercounting of women's votes, perhaps for the same reason. MAGA women whose opinions might have shifted post-op, who might have shifted post-Kamala Harris being a candidate, who might have shifted with Billie Eilish and Taylor Swift and other endorsements, right? But who are not likely to say so in front of their spouses. So we'll see. That's going to be an important factor. Obviously, you put the finger on the same dynamic that I'm interested in, which is ground game. My understanding is that as of today, the Harris campaign has about double the fundraising. She raised over $1 billion in less than 3 months, which is, as you having run campaigns in the past, well, no, that's a fair chunk of change, right? She's got twice the staff. I'm not twice the staff, 10 times the staff of the Trump campaign, and 20 times the number of volunteers on the ground. Yeah. And so to me, the ground game matters. Yes. And while it's, on the one hand, you've got Twitter and Elon Musk and the inevitable magnetic draw that Trump is for the media, that ground game is an important factor. Yep. And the final factor for me remains, and this is one that we just have to see, demography. I think Trump's his base is older, they're rural, they're largely white, largely unvaccinated, and there's no question that they're smaller and less enthusiastic today than they were in 2016. Right. And I think less so than they were in 2020. So the big question, this is the challenge, and this maybe is one of the areas we'll kind of wrap it up on, is polling. Right. Obviously, as a political leader with a long career, polling has changed. Yeah. And yet it remains something that we look at to try to at least provide a snapshot. Yeah. And to try to understand the elections writ large. There's going to be a lot of talk about polling. There is today, because the polls seem to have tightened, at least in the amalgamated polls. There's going to be a lot in the last 3 weeks of the campaign. I want to address that in terms of tell our viewership how they should, what they should be looking for in terms of polling, how they should understand it. Should they be worried? Should they not be worried?
I think unless somebody builds a 5-point lead, forget the polls. 5-point lead, yeah, that probably means that's where it's going. But anything less than that, it's going to tend to be a result based on, obviously going to be a result of the people who turn out on the day or turn out before the day, but turn out. It is true. Generally speaking, you would say in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, if anything is going to shift, it'll be shifted by those who are working on the ground. That is the period of the ordinary ward healer. It is the end of the campaign. And I think that if Kamala wins, it will be because her people turn up. And that would be decisive. So I don't think you're going to be able to tell, I'm afraid to say, because I'm not sure any poll is going to get out to 5 points. And therefore, it's all going to be margin of error stuff. So the polls don't matter that much. I love my former leader, Bob Hawke. All politicians, including me, are obsessed with polls. But for Bob, and he's the only political leader I've ever known to whom this applies. He liked polling, but when he got a poll, it was the start of the argument, not the end. So he would look to see, oh, gee, my position, which I think is essential for the country on X, Y, and Z, is not popular. It was tariffs or something like that, is not popular. Right. What is the argument that we can use to get them to my position? That was always his response. He would never run away from public opinion or kowtow to it. He'd do what he thought was right. He's the only politician I know to whom that applied, and it doesn't apply to me.
Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap it up. I mean, because that is an indication of clear leadership, rather than following the polls, using the polls as a tool. I actually would probably agree with you that in the last three weeks, the temptation is going to be for Republicans, as they did in the final weeks of the 2022 campaign, find great hope in the polling that seemed to show a red wave, and for Democrats to be full of angst. I think we're in a modern era where there are so many polls and they're differing quality. The old, which is now an old innovation of poll amalgamators like 538 and Silver, is less useful. I think you're going to find that already in the last several weeks and for the next 3 weeks for sure, that a vast majority of the polls that are being fed into the models are partisan, relatively low quality, designed to push a narrative. And interestingly enough, it's a narrative which the Democrats have not fought back against because they want this sense of existential dread. They want people to not take it for granted. There was a sense in 2016 that people thought that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in, so they just didn't bother. They can waste their vote on third-party candidates, et cetera. And I think, so at this point, both sides, the Republican Party want to engender hope on their side and encourage them to come out, and the Democrats want to engender fear on their side and encourage them to come out. And so we share that same assessment, which is ignore the polls for the next 3 weeks. And hopefully in this conversation, Kim and I have at least been able to identify one or two things which will be interesting for our community as you seek to understand, what is probably the most important political development taking place globally over the next 3 weeks, and certainly one that will have an impact on us in Australia as well. So thank you, Kim. Really appreciate it.
Good. No worries.